All right, well, welcome everyone to our seminar on annual emissions reporting. So here's the outline for today's presentation and the various programs that we will talk about. And we're going to start with greenhouse gas reporting. There are provincial and federal programs for greenhouse gas reporting. I'm going to start with the provincial program. And note that in 2016, new legislation was passed with regards to greenhouse gas reporting. And that was Ontario Regulation 143, which took effect January 1st, 2017, and was implemented to support Ontario's cap-and-trade program. So what this means is that for reporting greenhouse gas emissions from 2017 onwards, you would use the new regulation and guidance, which was issued in November. But if you're reporting previous years, you'll follow OREG 452, which is the old regulation, and the appropriate guidance for the year that you are reporting. The regulation still applies to a person or a facility that generates greenhouse gases if it's generated from any of the specified greenhouse gas activities. So these activities are the same as they were for OREG 452. There is an additional one, which is indirect thermal energy use. Other than that, however, it's the same list. So 143 is, when it comes to thresholds, the same as 452. So if you exceed the threshold of 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent each year, then you're required to report. Reporting is due June 1st of each year. There are allowable deductions for biomass burning and for indirect thermal energy use. And if you emit more than 25,000 tons, then you're required to have your emissions verified by an accredited verification body, which means any verification body that is certified to ISO 14065 standards. So it can't just be any company, they have to have the correct certification. This is the list of greenhouse gases in OREG 143. The thing I want to highlight here is column 5, which is the global warming potential, which is the number that you'll use to convert your mass emission rate of a given contaminant to the equivalent CO2 emission rate. As I said earlier, there is new guidance issued in November of last year for the new regulation, so that guidance document is available on the ministry's website. I'm going to go through the information that's available in the guide, discuss how you would use that information in order to provide an example of how greenhouse gases are reported. So the guide is divided into what's called different appendices, which in each appendix corresponds to one of the specified greenhouse gas emitting activities within the regulation. And each appendix follows approximately the same outline. The first section outlines information that must be reported under the specific activity, while subsequent sections provide methods for estimating greenhouse gas emissions and data requirements for those methods. I'm going to use general stationary combustion as the example. It's one of the more common examples we come across and is an example that I think most people understand. So the first part of the chapter, as I said, outlines the reporting requirements for general stationary combustion. And so those items are listed in A through F, which are basically the numbers and the information that you have to report to the ministry dependent upon the method that you use to estimate your greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, item D, your average carbon content of your fuel. So if you don't use that to estimate your emissions, then you're not required to report it. But of course, you are required to report the values that you do use. The chapter then goes into calculation methods for estimating CO2 emissions. The methods start with very general methods and work their way towards very facility-specific methods. So method 1 uses default CO2 emission factors and default high heat values to estimate greenhouse gas emissions. So you take those two values, you multiply by the amount of fuel that you use, multiply by a conversion factor, and you get your CO2 emissions. These default values are provided within the appendix. They're at the back of the appendix. And so there's nothing here you have to do to get information from your facility other than the amount of fuel that you used. The next method then starts to become more facility specific. So it's the same calculation, only now you use a default emission factor, but a high heat value that is either provided by the supplier or measured by the person or the facility. So it's important to note that in Ontario, for natural gas, both Enbridge and Union Gas provide high heat values on their website. And that's important to remember because there are restrictions on which method you're allowed to use. And I'll discuss that in just a couple slides. And then at the bottom of the slide here is part of a table that's taken from the end of the appendix where you can see there's the default emission factors for CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. The next method, method 3, takes measurements of fuel carbon content either by the supplier or by the facility and uses that to estimate CO2 emissions. And so again, we're starting to get more specific. So you're no longer using default values, you're starting to use actually supplied or measured values on site. And then the last method is to actually measure your CO2 emissions using something called a continuous emissions monitoring system, or CEMS. And that, of course, becomes very facility specific because you're actually measuring your CO2 emissions. Now, the method that you use, method 1 through 4, must be chosen based on your best available data and restrictions that are outlined further in more detail in the appendix. So for example, method 1 can't be used at a facility for which you either routinely perform fuel sampling or that fuel sampling is provided by the supplier, so in particular the high heat value. And so this comes back to what I was saying about Union Gas and Enbridge. They provide it on their website. They provide it within the requirements of the guidance document. So if you're doing on-site measurements, there are restrictions of how you do those measurements, and I'll touch upon those in just a moment. And both Enbridge and Union Gas meet those requirements, and so you can, what that means in Ontario is that for the combustion of natural gas, you step straight to method 2. You can't use method 1 because the supplier will provide you with the high heat value for their fuel. For methane and nitrous oxide, for general stationary combustion, there are similar methods in the appendix. They are basically the exact same methods, just with different high heat values, obviously, and emission factors. And there are also similar restrictions on which method you can use. The rest of the chapter provides information on sampling analysis and measurement requirements. So this is what I touched upon just a moment ago. If you're going to measure your fuel carbon content, your high heat value, or if you're going to run a continuous emissions monitoring system, then you have to do all of those within the requirements set out in the appendix. And those are listed in the appendix. And then there's also procedures for estimating missing data. So as you can see, under the provincial program, there's pretty strict guidance on and requirements that must be followed as far as the decision tree goes in terms of how you estimate your emissions. The federal program, however, isn't quite as prescriptive. So the federal program applies to any facility that emits 10,000 tons of CO2 equivalent or more in a given year. Reporting is due June 1st, just like the provincial program. The list of greenhouse gases is approximately the same as the provincial program, but there are slight differences. So there are some that are missing, such as nitrogen trifluoride, and the list of HFCs and PFCs are slightly different. It's also important to note that the global warming potentials are not always the same between the two programs. And so what that means is that in some cases, you'll need to do your calculations twice for the once each for the two different programs. So you won't be reporting the same numbers necessarily to the programs. Oh, there we go. Under the federal program, you're required to report emissions under certain source categories, and those source categories are specific to the greenhouse gas. So for CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, there's 8 source categories. For sulfur hexafluoride, HFCs, and PFCs, you're only required for 2 source categories. You also report your total quantity in tons of CO2 from biomass combustion, but you don't account for those CO2 emissions in your total reported. So it's a separate number that's reported, but you don't remove it from your your total reported CO2 emissions. Currently, there are no specific protocols to define how reporters must calculate their greenhouse gas emissions under the federal program. However, reporters must use methods that are consistent with the IPCC, the 2006 IPCC guidelines. Those methods include direct measurement and monitoring, mass balance, emission factors, and engineering estimates. There is guidance documents available from Environment Canada. There's supposed to be a new guide available this month. I just checked this morning and I didn't see that a new guide was available, so not entirely sure or clear when in March, but the website does say in March, so supposedly there should be one coming out soon. And that's it for greenhouse gases. I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point. I'll just check the chat. Not seeing any. So if there are no questions, I'll just keep moving on to the next program, and I can obviously come back to questions at the end if you think of something along the way. So next I'm going to talk about the National Pollutant Release Inventory and Ontario Regulation 127. So most of what I'm going to talk about in this section will actually be about NPRI. However, much of the guidance for NPRI does apply to Ontario Regulation 127, so you can use that information for that program. So both programs are emission inventory programs used to collect information about pollutants released to the environment. NPRI is a federal program and tracks releases to air, water, as well as transfers for disposal and recycling. OREG 127 is administered by the MOE, and it tracks air emissions only and only for one compound. Both are annual reports due June 1st of each year, and both programs are mandatory and not voluntary. And this is actually something I didn't point out about greenhouse gas reporting. Greenhouse gas reporting is also not voluntary, it's mandatory as well. And in fact, all the programs we're going to talk about today are mandatory, not voluntary. So as a general overview to NPRI, so facilities that manufacture, process, or otherwise use one or more of the NPRI listed substances at the prescribed conditions are required to report. And what you report is discharges to all media, including air, water, land, and on-site disposals, transfers to other facilities, and so on. Reporting requirements for NPRI apply to any facility where the employee threshold is met, which is 20,000 hours a year, where activities to which the employee threshold does not take place, where activities to which the employee threshold does not apply take place, Where the employee threshold is not met, but the reporting criteria for Part 4 substances are met, if it's a pipeline installation. And then you also have to meet other reporting criteria, such as the mass and concentration thresholds. For Ontario Regulation 127, as I said, it's similar. So any facility that manufactures, process, or otherwise uses acetone are required to submit annual reports. But that's only where the employee threshold is met and where the reporting threshold is met, which for acetone is 3,000 tons. Sorry, 3 tons. And you're only required to report the quantity discharged to air. So both programs, you report annually the amount released to the environment, and they do not have legislated legal limits such as OELs or POI values for permitting. So once you report to these programs, as far as these programs are concerned, there's no more work to do. That you just report and you're done. This is just to highlight that the program NPRI is not voluntary. It is mandatory. There's penalties set out within the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So, if you meet the criteria for reporting, then you have to report. Who uses the data that's reported to these programs? A number of groups can. A number of them are listed here. We ourselves also have used the data from time to time, as well as other air quality consultants. One common use is to gather an emissions inventory for environmental assessment purposes over a large area, so that you can get an assessment of background concentrations. The NPRI substance list is broken into 6 different reporting groups for a total of approximately 330 chemicals. And the way that you go through the assessment and reporting protocols depends on the substance and the group to which the substance belongs. And I'll come back to that shortly. So here's just an example of some of the Part 1A substances. The thing I want to highlight here is the threshold column, which I briefly mentioned. So that's the usage amount for each chemical that you have to meet. And then the last column is NPRI indicates if the chemical is considered a VOC. So Environment Canada does provide some guidance on which substances they consider to be VOCs. And that's important for Part 4 VOCs as a whole. So this is the list of Part 4 substances. And so under VOCs, you're required to group all VOCs and report them as a group. So as I said, Environment Canada does provide some guidance. However, the guidance isn't very detailed. It's essentially 2 pieces of guidance. First of all, as I said, if a substance in NPRI is considered a VOC, then they'll list it as a VOC. And the second piece of information is an exclusionary list, which is available from Environment Canada, which is essentially saying is a list of chemicals that are not considered VOCs. Beyond that, it's up to the reporting facility to decide if a chemical is a VOC. And the only definition that Environment Canada provides is that a VOC is a chemical that participates in atmospheric photochemical reactions. Now, there are definitions from the US EPA and the EU that can be used that deal with vapor pressures, boiling points, that kind of chemical-specific information that you can use. Lastly, this is just an example of some of the Part 5 substances, and I'm just putting this up to highlight the second last column, the threshold, the difference in thresholds, and to highlight that all Part 5 chemicals are considered VOCs. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that some of the Part 5 chemicals do show up in Parts 1 to 3, and that's just a reflection of the difference in how the different parts within NPRI are reported, and that relates to the threshold. So what are the reporting steps for NPRI? Well, the first step is to determine your reporting status. So there are exemptions to the program, so that would be the first thing to check if you're exempt. If you're not exempt, the next thing would be, do you even use any of the substances that are listed under NPRI? Because if you don't, then the program doesn't apply to you. If you do use the chemicals, then obviously you'd need to determine if you meet the reporting thresholds. If you meet the reporting threshold for a given chemical, then you have to estimate your releases and transfers of that chemical and then report those to NPRI. The thing I want to note here is that it's really important for facilities to determine their reporting status each year. NPRI does provide updated guidance every 2 years, and so just because you didn't report last year doesn't mean you won't have to report this year due to a change in guidance from Environment Canada. So we always stress it's important that just because you haven't reported last year or even for the last couple of years, that you determine your reporting status each year. So now I want to talk a bit about the reporting thresholds, which vary depending on the part to which a chemical belongs. So Part 1A substances have a mass threshold of 10 tons, so that means you have to use the chemical in an amount of 10 tons, or you have to manufacture or process it in an amount of 10 tons. But the other thing to keep in mind is that there's also a concentration threshold. So for Part 1A substances, the concentration threshold is 1%, which means that if there's a product you're using that contains one of the reportable substances, but it's in the product at a concentration of less than 1%, then that portion of the chemical doesn't count towards the mass threshold. You don't need to assess that portion of that chemical. For Part 1B substances, the mass thresholds are significantly lower, down all the way to 5 kilograms in some cases, ranging to 1,000 kilograms. And even the concentration thresholds vary quite a bit. So it's important to keep in mind those two thresholds when you're doing your assessment. And then I want to jump to Part 4, where it's important to note there is no concentration threshold. It's just simply the quantity that's released to air, so there's only a mass threshold. So if you release 10 tons of VOCs to air, then you report VOCs. Part 5 substances, again, there's no concentration threshold, and it's the total amount released to air. But Part 5 is only triggered if you meet the threshold for VOCs under Part 4. So what are some of the calculations you'd have to do under NPRI? So you have to figure out what your manufactured, processed, or otherwise used number is for a given chemical. That's largely based on SDS, so that would be for usages and usage amounts. If you don't track your usage amounts, we often use purchased amounts since they are generally reflective of usage amounts. Then you'd estimate your either your emissions or your transfers off-site. And to do that, of course, you'd have to identify emission sources, gather supporting information, and then do the actual calculations. Reporting is done online via the single window information manager. So this is just a screenshot. So you'd log in using your account, and you'd step through the reporting. And the reporting program just brings up windows, and you just fill in the information as you go through each window. NPRI provides guidance every 2 years on the program, and that includes updates. So they update the program or review the program every 2 years. If there are changes to they're listed in the guide at the front of the guide. And so if you find the most recent reporting guide, you'll find whatever those changes might be. So the most recent guide is for 2016 and 2017, and at the front of it there are changes to NPRI. One of the more significant changes was a reduction in thresholds for cobalt, both in the mass concentration and the mass threshold and the concentration threshold. So this highlights what I was talking about the need to reassess your reporting status every year, because we've had clients who previously did not need to report cobalt, but in 2016 they did because of these changes to the threshold. Other changes include a change in the contextual information that's required for water releases. There were a number of chemicals that were removed from the program. And that's it for NPRI. I don't see any questions, but I can just wait a moment. If someone has a question, I'll take a drink here. So if there are no questions, then I'll just move on. So I'm going to move on to Ontario's Toxics Reduction Act, or TRA. The purpose of TRA is to reduce the use and creation of toxic substances and to inform the public on the use and creation of toxic substances within the province of Ontario. Does the program apply to you? Well, the first question you should ask is, did you report to NPRI or OREG 127? If you didn't report to either of those programs, then TRA just automatically does not apply to you. If you did report to those programs, the next question you have to ask is, what is my facility's NAICS code, which is a classification system. So if you're a manufacturing facility or a mineral processing facility, then TRA would apply to you. Again, this is just a slide to highlight that TRA is not voluntary. It is mandatory. There are offenses and fines and penalties outlined within the Act. So what do you need to do under the Toxics Reduction Act? Well, what you're required to do is to track and quantify the flow of substances through your facility. Now, it's important to note that you only have to track and quantify substances that you reported to NPRI and and OREG 127. So you don't have to do every chemical, just the ones you had to report. Once you've done that tracking and quantifying, you would then prepare a reduction plan, provide summaries of that plan to both the ministry and to the public. If necessary, report annually on reduction progress, and then at specified time intervals, review your plans. And that, of course, means you have to retrack and quantify a substance through your facility. So it's a bit of a cycle. We like to consider TRA an accounting program, not just an emissions program. Because what the ministry wants you to do is, under the TRA, they want you to identify stages and processes at your facility, create process flow diagrams for those processes, and then choose methods to track and quantify chemicals as they move through those processes and process flow diagrams. Once you've done that, you're able to compare the input to your facility to the output of your facility and check for imbalances for given chemicals. The intent of the input-output balance exercise is not to obtain a zero balance, as it is recognized that that's rarely achieved. The intent, however, is to use the input-output balance as a qualitative indicator to evaluate the approaches that you've chosen for tracking and quantifying the substance through the facility. So it's used to identify data gaps within your methods. You are allowed to have a non-zero balance. However, if you determine you have a non-zero balance, then your facility must provide an explanation that describes the cause of the discrepancy. And then that reasoning has to be kept on site at the facility. There's a number of stages for reporting to TRA. So the first year you report to TRA, the due date is June 1st, and you would report facility information, your accounting information, So the numbers of the chemical into the plant, out of the plant, air emissions, and so on. And then that has to be certified by highest ranking employee and the planner. By December 31st of that same year, you are then required to complete a TRA plan, or what we call a toxic substance reduction plan. In subsequent years, you are then required to report much more information. So key to note here is that you start reporting about the objectives of your plans, reduction progress, if you're looking at reduction options, if there were changes to your tracking method, process changes, and again, your plan implementation progress, if you are implementing any type of reduction option. I want to highlight on changing of quantification methods. So under TRA, you're not allowed to change your quantification methods from year to year. And the reason for that is that the ministry wants to ensure that when they're comparing data from year to year, they're comparing apples to apples. You are, however, allowed to change your method under 3 conditions. So first of all, where it's required by law, at the time of a plan review, or where recommended by a certified planner, which is generally after the first year you've reported a chemical. So what goes into a TRA plan? There's quite a bit of information. So there's objectives of the plan, whether or not you're looking at actually reducing a substance, the process flow diagrams and the accounting that you've done. You have to look at costs, both direct and indirect, related to the chemical. You then have to also assess 7 categories of reduction options, which are provided by the ministry. And then any implementation plan. So if you determine that you are going to reduce and implement a reduction option, then you would generate an implementation plan. There's also planner recommendations and certification of the plan required. As I said, the ministry does provide 7 categories for reduction options. You are required to assess all 7 categories to determine if reduction options exist. If an option exists, you're then required to determine if it's technically feasible, and then if it's technically feasible, you're required to determine if it's economically feasible. If a facility determines that a reduction option is feasible, both technically and economically, you're then required to generate an implementation plan if you're going to actually implement it. And so for each reduction option that you're going to implement, you have to generate a timetable for implementation and estimate the amounts that will be reduced by that reduction option. As I said, there are plan summaries that must be submitted to both the ministry and the public. They're actually also supposed to be submitted to your employees, or at least your employees are supposed to know that they exist. And then, obviously, being summaries, they contain much less information than the full plan itself. TRA plans must be reviewed at set intervals as outlined in the Act. The date for first plan review is December 31st of this year. So that means that by December 31st of this year, if you have an existing TRA plan, you must review it and, if need be, update it if you're looking at changing reduction options or so on. You're then actually required to review the plans every 5 years thereafter. You're allowed to do interim reviews the year after a significant process change. And then any time that you change a plan as a result of a review, it must be recertified by the planner and by the highest ranking employee on site. I have significant in quotations there. What is significant? The ministry does provide guidance on this. So a significant process change occurs when a facility adds a new distinct process that uses or creates a prescribed toxic substance and is not already described in the plan, or if you alter an existing process that results in at least a 15% increase in the use or creation of the prescribed toxic substance. An increase in simple throughput or production of 15% within a process does not constitute a significant process change. Exiting the program, you are allowed to exit TRA if you no longer are required to report a given chemical. So if you stop using a chemical or stop creating a chemical, then you can create what's called an exit record within the program that basically tells the ministry you no longer need to report this chemical. If, however, in subsequent years, you start using or creating that chemical again and you have to report it, you have to re-enter the program. If that is less than 3 years after the creation of the exit record, then you're allowed to revive your old TRA plan if it's still applicable. If it's been more than 3 years, then you have to create a new plan for that chemical. So some of the lessons we've learned to date, we've discovered that because TRA is an accounting program, there's often a need, well, there is a requirement under TRA to look more closely at the numbers than under NPRI, for example. So what we've often found, or not often, but sometimes we found that facilities were reporting when they didn't have to, or they weren't reporting when they should be. And that's, as I say, sort of a reflection of the fact that TRA needs, requires a facility to take a closer look at the numbers. We've also found that most facilities had already reduced usages as far as possible. These are considered toxic substances, so often there's extra costs associated with purchasing, safety equipment, disposal, and so obviously that costs a company money, and so most companies have figured out ways to reduce the usages as much as possible. So we've often found that there aren't reduction options available because they've already been implemented. And then lastly, we recommend that once you've done the reporting June 1st, if there's a new TRA plan that you have to generate, we do recommend starting as early as possible. It does take time to generate and review the reduction options, and then if need be, do technical feasibility studies, economic feasibility studies. Depending on your processes, those are not quick things to do. They can take time. And so we do recommend that you start as early as possible. I know June 1st to December 31st seems like a lot of time, but it can go by pretty quickly. So once you know you need to do a plan for December 31st, then we do suggest you start that planning process as soon as possible. Under TRA, a toxic substance is considered those listed under NPRI and OREG 127, but the Act does require that Ontario review the list every 5 years. So the Ministry has implemented what they call the Living List Framework, and it's a protocol that will allow the additions, deletions, or modifications to the list of substances considered toxic. So before this framework was implemented, basically any changes to NPRI and OREG 127 followed through to the Act, to the Act. But what the Ministry is looking at doing is, in future years, if need be, to have their own list of chemicals. And so in future years, it's entirely possible that the list of chemicals between NPRI and TRA will be different. But for now, they're the same. They haven't changed the list, and any changes to NPRI still follow through at this point. There are some proposed amendments to the regulation that's under the Act. The first one is to change the date of the first plan review from December 31st of this year to December 31st of next year. And subsequent reviews would take place every 6th year instead of every 5th year. Now, this is still only being proposed, and it hasn't been adopted yet. So what we've been told by the ministry is that all regulated facilities should continue to work towards a plan review in 2018. There's also some amendments to requirements for looking at reduction or estimating reductions based on the implementation of reduction options, as well as protecting business confidentiality by not requiring detailed reporting of changes from year to year. So those are some of the more significant changes that they're looking at with regards to the regulation. That's it for TRA. Okay, so someone was pointing out in the comments that they're looking at making changes, which I've just touched upon here. If there are no other questions, we can move on to the last program, which is ChemTRAC, which is the City of Toronto reporting bylaw. So it's also called the Environmental Reporting and Disclosure Bylaw, and it requires local facilities to report on any of the listed toxic chemicals that a facility manufactures, uses, or releases to the environment if the amounts are equal to or above the reporting threshold. If that sounds familiar, it should. It sounds exactly like NPRI, and we often refer to this as the city's own NPRI. The reason for that, though, is that the thresholds for reporting are different between NPRI and ChemTRAC. The list of chemicals is also different. So this is the list of chemicals for Group A under the bylaw. It's the entire list for Group A. And so it's much shorter than NPRI. And you'll note that the mass reporting thresholds are significantly lower. So for example, the first one, acetaldehyde, has a threshold of 10 tons under NPRI, but only 100 kilograms under ChemTRAC. And that's common for most of these chemicals, pretty much all of them. And concentration thresholds can vary as well. The rest of the chemicals for ChemTRAC are in Group B, which are PAHs, and then Group C. So between those two slides, that's all of the chemicals for ChemTRAC. So it's a significantly smaller list that you have to deal with, but it's also smaller reporting thresholds that you have to deal with. Who's affected by the bylaw? It's any facility or business in the City of Toronto that uses or releases any of the chemicals listed in the bylaw. The deadline for reporting is June 30th. So the city was nice enough to give you an extra 30 days to do your reporting after you're done all your NPRI and TRA reporting. Just like the other programs, there are exemptions for certain types of facilities. So if you're a medical or dental office or a construction site, then the program doesn't apply. There is a guide available on the city's website that outlines some of the reporting information that you might need. The program, as I say, is essentially it's NPRI, but on a smaller scale. So much of the guidance for NPRI does apply to the ChemTRAC program. Within the guide, there is a decision tree that I just wanted to highlight that sort of steps you through whether or not you're required to report to the program. So that can be of use to some people if you're not sure. I mean, the first question you ask is literally, are you in Toronto? And if the answer is no, then you don't have to worry about ChemTRAC at all. If you are, then you go through the usual questions. Are you exempt? No. Do you use a substance? Yes. Did you meet the thresholds? Yes. Okay, then you need to report. So if we look at, in particular, the last three programs, I say three, I'm kind of grouping OREG 127 with NPRI here. You can kind of see how the different programs compare to each other. So NPRI is, annual emissions reporting to all media, whereas TRA is the same information from NPRI, but then also detailed tracking through the facility and reduction planning. And then ChemTRAC is NPRI, but with much lower reporting thresholds for certain chemicals. So in summary, so greenhouse gas reporting, both federally and provincially, is required. NPRI OREG 127 continue as before, just with the changes that were actually started last year. For TRA, you should prepare for a plan review this year. The timeline for that acceptance of the amendment to the regulation isn't known at this point, so you should prepare for a plan review. And then lastly, ChemTRAC reporting continues for all facilities. So that's all of the programs summarized. If you have any questions, feel free to type them out. You can wait for people to type in questions if they have them. That's my contact information. So if you have follow-up questions and you're not, you don't think of something now, I know I often do that, I'll think of it later. So by all means, send me an email or give me a phone call, and I'll be happy to go over any questions that you might have. So that's it. I'm not seeing any questions being typed out. So if there are no further questions, then I want to thank everyone for attending. Hopefully the information was useful to you. And as I said, if you have further questions, by all means, send me an email, give me a call. Of course, if you want assistance with your reporting, send me an email, give me a call. We can discuss. So thanks again, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.